The first thing Arthur became aware of was not a sound, but the absence of it. He drifted up from the depths of anesthesia into a world muffled and remote, as if he were listening through a thick wall of cotton. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was a familiar sterile white. The air carried the faint, clean scent of antiseptic. A hospital room? It had worked. He was alive. His wife, Eleanor, was sitting in a chair by the window, her head bowed over a magazine. His son, Mark, stood beside her, scrolling impatiently through his phone. They hadn't noticed he was awake. He watched them for a moment, this familiar tableau of his family. Eleanor, still elegant at 62, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her posture impeccable even in the uncomfortable visitor's chair. And Mark, 40, with his father's height but none of his patience, already looking like he was late for a meeting, his expensive suit jarringly out of place in the quiet room. The surgery had been a gamble, a complex procedure on his inner ear to combat a rare form of vertigo that had plagued him for years. The surgeon, a brisk, confident man named Dr. Albright, had been clear about the risks. "We might be able to fix the vertigo, Arthur," he had said, his gaze direct, "but there's a significant chance you could lose the hearing in that ear. Possibly both. It's a delicate area." Arthur had accepted the risk. The constant dizziness, the feeling of the world tilting beneath his feet, had become unbearable. He longed for stillness, for solid ground. If silence was the price for that, he was willing to pay it. A nurse bustled in, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. "Ah, Mr. Albright, you're awake," she said, her voice bright and cheerful. "How are you feeling?" It was in that precise moment that the idea took root. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was a spontaneous, almost mischievous impulse, born of 1,000 tiny slots and a growing sense of his own invisibility. For the past few years, he had felt himself fading from his own family's life. His opinions were met with polite, dismissive smiles. His stories were interrupted. Conversations would swirl around him, over him, but rarely with him. He was becoming a piece of furniture in his own home, a familiar, comfortable object that no one really saw anymore. What did they really think? What did they say when they believed he wasn't listening? He looked at the nurse, then at Eleanor and Mark, who were now standing by his bedside, their faces arranged in masks of dutiful concern. He kept his own face a perfect, placid blank. He did not respond to the nurse's question. "Mr. Albright," she repeated, a little louder, "can you hear me?" He continued to stare straight ahead, as if looking at something on the far wall that only he could see. He saw the nurse's smile falter. She exchanged a worried glance with Eleanor. "Let's try a little test," the nurse said gently. She stood on his right side out of his direct line of sight and clapped her hand sharply. He didn't flinch. He had steeled himself for it, a small internal bracing. She moved to his left side and clapped again. Nothing. He remained perfectly still, a statue of serene incomprehension. He watched their faces. He saw the professional concern on the nurse's face morph into pity. He saw the flicker of irritation in Mark's eyes, the impatience of a busy man dealing with yet another complication. And he saw the look on Eleanor's face. It wasn't just concern. It was something else, something he couldn't quite decipher, a complex mixture of anxiety, frustration, and, was that a flicker of calculation? "I'm so sorry," the nurse said softly to Eleanor. "It seems the surgery may have resulted in complete hearing loss, as Dr. Albright warned. We'll conduct more thorough tests later, of course." Eleanor nodded, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of perfect wifely distress. "Oh, my poor Arthur," she murmured. Mark put a comforting arm around her shoulder. His eyes, however, were already on his watch. The charade continued as they prepared him for discharge. He allowed them to dress him, to guide him into the wheelchair, to speak about him as if he were no longer there. "We'll have to make some adjustments at home," Eleanor said to Mark, her voice loud and slow, as if speaking to a child. "It's going to be a challenge." "Don't worry, Mom," Mark replied, his voice equally loud. "We'll handle it. We'll take care of everything." The ride home was a revelation. Freed from the need to include him in their conversation, they spoke openly. They talked about the cost of the potential home care, about the inconvenience of it all, about how this would impact their upcoming travel plans. Not once did they speak of his feelings, his fear, his loss. They spoke of him as a problem to be managed, a new, difficult line item in the budget of their lives. When they got him home, they settled him into his favorite armchair in the living room, a plush, comfortable chair that faced the garden. They put a blanket over his lap and a glass of water on the table beside him. "There you go, Dad," Mark said, patting his shoulder with a heartiness that felt utterly false. "You just rest. We'll handle everything." Arthur closed his eyes, feigning the deep, exhausted sleep of a post-operative patient. He heard them retreat to the kitchen, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of the house. He listened, his senses now honed to a razor's edge. He was a spy in his own life, a ghost at his own wake. He heard the clink of glasses, the splash of wine being poured. Then their voices, low and conspiratorial, believing they were safe in his silent world. "Well, that's that," Mark said with a heavy sigh. "This is going to be a nightmare. We'll have to sell the boat. There's no way we can afford full-time care on top of everything else." "We're not getting full-time care," Eleanor's voice replied, and there was a new, hard edge to it that made the hairs on Arthur's arms stand up. "What are you talking about, Mom? He can't be left alone. He's deaf. He's an old man." "He's more than that, Mark," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound of pure, chilling intimacy. "He's a liability. This changes everything." There was a pause. Arthur held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then he heard the words that would forever alter the landscape of his world. It was Eleanor, his wife of 40 years, the woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with. Her voice was a soft, venomous hiss. "It's time to get rid of the old man. He's not all there anymore. This surgery was the final straw. It's time to move on to the next phase of the plan." The words struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs, a silent, internal gasp. The plan. It wasn't a spontaneous thought. It was a pre-existing strategy. His deafness was not a tragedy to them. It was an opportunity. He sat perfectly still in his chair, the blanket warm on his lap, his eyes closed, a placid, sleeping old man. But behind the mask his mind was reeling, the comfortable, familiar world he had known shattering into a million sharp, glittering pieces. His experiment had yielded its first result, and it was more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. In the days that followed, Arthur perfected his role. He became a master of the blank stare, the delayed, confused reaction, the placid smile that revealed nothing. His deafness was a cloak of invisibility, and he wore it with the skill of a seasoned actor. The house, once his sanctuary, became his stage. The dynamic of his family shifted almost immediately. He was no longer a participant in their lives. He was a piece of scenery. They moved around him, spoke through him, and lived as if he were an inanimate object, a grandfather clock that had stopped ticking but was too much trouble to remove. Eleanor, who had once maintained a facade of wifely affection, dropped it completely. She would place his meals in front of him with a sigh of weary martyrdom, often not even making eye contact. She would walk into the living room where he was reading the newspaper and have long, loud phone conversations, her voice a constant stream of complaints. "You have no idea, Susan," she said one afternoon to her sister, her voice sharp with resentment. "He just sits there, like a lump. I have to do everything. Cut his food, make sure he takes his pills. It's like having a child again, but without any of the joy." Arthur sat behind the paper, his eyes scanning the stock market report, his ears absorbing every poisonous word. He learned that his collection of antique maps, which he had spent a lifetime curating, was now referred to as that dusty old junk in the study. Eleanor was already planning to have it appraised. "It's probably worth a pretty penny," she told her sister. "God knows we'll need it for his care." Mark's visits became more frequent, but they were not for Arthur's benefit. He would stride into the house, kiss his mother on the cheek, and then proceed to use the living room as his personal office, pacing back and forth while making aggressive business calls. He spoke openly about his financial troubles, his voice a litany of bad investments, looming deadlines, and mounting debts. The Henderson deal fell through, he lamented to his mother one evening, standing right in front of Arthur's chair. "I'm in deep, Mom. If I don't come up with $50,000 by the end of the month, I'm going to lose everything." "Patience, darling," Eleanor soothed, her voice low. "We have a plan, remember? We just need to be careful. We need to let things settle." As he listened, Arthur's mind drifted back, sifting through the memories of the past, searching for the origin of this rot. He remembered Eleanor as a young woman, vibrant and full of laughter, her love for him a fierce, protective force. He remembered their early struggles, how they had faced every challenge as a team. When had she started to see him not as her partner, but as her portfolio? Was it after his first heart scare 5 years ago? Was it when he retired and his world became smaller, quieter, less impressive to her social circle? He thought of Mark. He remembered teaching him to ride a bike, the boy's small hand gripping his tightly, his face a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He remembered the pride he felt at Mark's college graduation. He had always been a driven, ambitious boy, but Arthur had mistaken that ambition for strength. He saw now that it was a brittle, hollow thing, a desperate need for external validation that had crowded out everything else. Had he pushed him too hard, or not hard enough? The questions were a dull, constant ache, a counterpoint to the sharp, fresh pain of their betrayal. In this new, silent world, Arthur also began to see the subtle alignments of loyalty and disloyalty around him. His granddaughter, Lila, was his only source of genuine light. She was 12, a quiet, observant girl with her father's height, but her grandfather's thoughtful eyes. She refused to accept his deafness as a barrier. When she visited, she would come armed with a small whiteboard and a marker. She would sit at his feet and write him messages. "Hi, Grandpa. How are you feeling today?" He would nod and smile, and she would write more. "Mom says you can't hear the birds anymore. I'm sorry. They're singing a really nice song this morning." Her notes were simple, pure, and utterly devoid of the pity or impatience that marked every other interaction. Her love was a quiet, steady warmth in the growing cold. One afternoon, while Eleanor was in the kitchen, Lila leaned in close and whispered in his ear, her breath warm against his cheek. "I know you can hear me, Grandpa," she whispered, so softly that even someone with perfect hearing might have missed it. "I don't know why you're pretending, but it's okay. I won't tell." She then squeezed his hand, gave him a small conspiratorial smile, and went back to writing on her whiteboard as if nothing had happened. Arthur's heart swelled with a love so fierce it almost brought tears to his eyes. He had an ally. Conversely, he saw the true colors of others. He heard Eleanor on the phone with her sister, Susan, laughing about his vacant expression. He heard Mark telling a friend that his father was basically a vegetable now. He became a repository of their secret cruelties, a silent witness to the casual dismantling of his own humanity. He was the invisible man, a ghost haunting the rooms of his own life. But ghosts, he was beginning to realize, have a unique advantage. They can see everything. They can learn every secret. And sometimes they can learn how to haunt the people who thought they were already buried. The initial shock of his family's betrayal slowly hardened into a cold, analytical resolve. Arthur was no longer just a passive observer. He was an intelligence operative gathering data behind enemy lines. He needed to understand the full scope of their plan, not just for his own survival, but to comprehend the depths to which his wife and son were willing to sink. He learned the true extent of Mark's financial desperation through a series of increasingly frantic phone calls his son made from the living room. Mark wasn't just in debt, he was drowning. A high-risk real estate venture he had invested in had collapsed, leaving him owing a substantial sum to some very unforgiving investors. He had leveraged everything, even taken out a secret second mortgage on his own home. The $50,000 he'd mentioned to Eleanor was just the tip of the iceberg. He was on the verge of complete financial ruin, a fact he had carefully concealed from everyone, including his own wife. "You don't understand," he hissed into his phone one afternoon, believing Arthur was asleep in his chair. "These aren't the kind of people you can just put off. I need the money, and I need it now." This desperation, Arthur realized, was the fuel for their cruel urgency. His assets were not just a desirable windfall for them, they were a lifeline for Mark. The full, horrifying shape of their plan was unveiled during a conversation he overheard a week later. It was a Sunday evening. Mark and Eleanor were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking wine, their voices low and conspiratorial. They thought he was watching a nature documentary on television, the volume turned up to a level that would be plausible for a deaf man. But Arthur had angled the mirror in the hallway just so. He could see their reflections, their gestures, their earnest, plotting faces. "The lawyer said the power of attorney I have is a good start," Eleanor began, swirling the red wine in her glass. "But it's not enough. It's for financial decisions, but it doesn't cover medical consent or living arrangements. If we want to move him, we need more." "So, what's the next step?" Mark asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Guardianship," Eleanor said, the word dropping into the quiet kitchen like a stone. "We need to petition the court to declare him legally incompetent. Once we have guardianship, we have total control. We can make all his decisions for him." Arthur's blood ran cold. Guardianship. It was a legal stripping of one's personhood, a declaration that you were no longer capable of steering your own ship. "But how do we prove he's incompetent?" Mark asked. "He seems physically fine, apart from the hearing." "That's the easy part," Eleanor said with a chilling confidence. "His deafness is the key. It isolates him. It makes him seem confused, detached. We just need a doctor to confirm it. And I've found the perfect one." She slid a business card across the table. Arthur couldn't read the name from his vantage point, but he heard it clearly. "Dr. Evans. Susan's friend recommended him. He's very understanding in these family situations. He specializes in geriatric evaluations and is known for being very sympathetic to the burdened family." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a spontaneous scheme, it was a well-researched, cold-blooded strategy. "So, Evans will write a report saying Dad's lost his marbles," Mark clarified, a note of grim excitement in his voice. "And, with that, we go to court?" "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "The report, combined with our testimony about his confusion and inability to care for himself, will be more than enough. The courts almost always side with the concerned family in these cases." Their ultimate goal became brutally clear. It wasn't just about getting access to his money to solve Mark's immediate problems. It was about liquidating his entire life. "Once we have guardianship," Mark mused, his voice now filled with the thrill of the chase, "we can sell the house. This place must be worth $1 million, easy. We pay off my debts, and the rest goes into a care fund for him, which, of course, we will manage. And we find him a nice, affordable place," Eleanor added. "Not one of those expensive resorts. A simple, clean facility. We'll tell everyone it's for his own safety and well-being, that he needs a structured environment. People will praise us for being such devoted, caring children." They clinked their wine glasses together, a silent toast to their own cleverness. And then Eleanor said the words that extinguished the last ember of love Arthur held for her in his heart. She laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You know, it's almost a blessing, this deafness. He's become so much easier to manage. So quiet, so compliant. He just sits there. It's perfect. Perfect." The word echoed in the silent chambers of Arthur's mind. His tragedy was their convenience. His loss was their gain. His silence was their opportunity. He sat in his armchair, the vibrant colors of a coral reef flashing silently on the television screen in front of him. He felt a profound, icy calm settle over him. The hurt was gone, burned away by the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their plan. This was no longer a sad family drama. It was a war. They had laid out their battle plan, confident in their victory. They had no idea that their opponent had heard every single word. His experiment was over. The fight for his life, his freedom, and his very identity had just begun. The laughter from the kitchen faded, but the chilling echo of his family's plan remained. Arthur sat in his armchair long after they had gone to bed, the television screen now a blank, black mirror reflecting his own still form. The shock had passed, leaving in its wake a state of hyper-clarity. He was a man on a burning ship, and he had two choices: sink with it or build a lifeboat in secret. He knew he couldn't fight this war alone. He was an old man, and they were already painting him as a confused one. He needed a trusted ally, someone with the skills and the loyalty to navigate the treacherous legal waters ahead. There was only one person he could turn to. The next afternoon, when Lila came to visit, he was ready. While Eleanor was busy in the garden, Arthur took out a small sealed envelope from his pocket. He pressed it into Lila's hand, his eyes conveying an urgency that made her go still. On the front, he had written a single name, David Chen. He then showed her a note he had prepared. "Lila, my love, this is the most important secret we will ever share. I need you to give this envelope to this man. Do not tell your mother or your father. Do not tell anyone. Can you do this for me?" Lila read the note, her young face serious. She looked from the note to her grandfather's pleading eyes. She didn't understand the details, but she understood the stakes. She saw the fear and the fight in him. She gave a single, solemn nod, tucked the envelope into her school bag, and gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. She was now a co-conspirator, a silent partner in his rebellion. David Chen was a lawyer of the old school, a man whose friendship with Arthur had been forged over 40 years of chess games and shared confidences. He was sharp, discreet, and fiercely loyal. When Lila appeared at his downtown office, a small, brave figure asking to see him personally, he knew it was serious. He read Arthur's letter, his expression growing grimmer with each line. He called Arthur that evening on a new, untraceable burner phone he had sent back with Lila. "Arthur, you old fox," David said, his voice a mixture of anger and admiration. "I knew they were vultures, but I never imagined this. What's our first move?" "First," Arthur replied, his voice low and clear over the secure line, "we gather irrefutable proof. They think I'm deaf. Let's use that." The counteroffensive began. The next day, David sent a package to Arthur via a discreet courier. Inside was a set of state-of-the-art, voice-activated digital recorders. They were minuscule, easily hidden, and had a battery life of over 100 hours. Arthur, feigning a new interest in organizing his old books, spent an afternoon planting the devices in strategic locations, under the kitchen table, behind a loose book on the study shelf, and inside a defunct radio in the living room. His house was now wired for sound. With the surveillance in place, Arthur began to meticulously document their conspiracy. He recorded their phone calls, their casual conversations, their strategic planning sessions. He captured Eleanor discussing Dr. Evans' fees. He captured Mark celebrating a dip in the stock market because it would make his father's investment portfolio look weaker in court. Every word was a nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. Simultaneously, on David Chen's advice, Arthur began a series of silent financial maneuvers. They couldn't risk him going to a bank in person. Instead, David guided him through the process of online banking, something his family assumed he was utterly incapable of. While Eleanor and Mark thought he was staring blankly at a news website, Arthur was a flurry of digital activity. He opened a new set of accounts at a different bank, under a newly formed holding company. He began the slow, methodical process of transferring his assets. He sold off blocks of stock, liquidated mutual funds, and moved the proceeds into the new, invisible accounts. He was carefully dismantling his financial life, piece by piece, leaving behind an empty shell for his children to fight over. He created an irrevocable trust for Lila, ensuring her future was protected from the fallout he knew was coming. His final move was the most cunning. He began to create a trap, baiting it with the very thing his children craved. He knew they would eventually try to get him to sign documents. He needed to control that interaction. He started to accidentally leave old, outdated bank statements on his desk, showing accounts with substantial but not enormous balances. He wanted them to believe that all his wealth was still sitting there, accessible and vulnerable. He also began to escalate his performance. He became even more confused and helpless. He would misplace his glasses. He would stare at the television with a vacant expression for hours. He would ask Eleanor the same question 3 times in a row. He played the part of a man sliding into dementia so perfectly that he sometimes frightened himself. He was luring them in, making them overconfident, encouraging them to make their move. He was no longer just a spy. He was a hunter, patiently setting a snare for the predators who had once stalked him. He was building his case, not just for a courtroom, but for the final, inevitable confrontation where he would prove that the silent, helpless old man they saw was the most dangerous man they had ever known. The day Dr. Evans was scheduled to visit, the atmosphere in the house was thick with a cloying, artificial sweetness. Eleanor was a whirlwind of performative care. She fluffed the pillows on Arthur's armchair, brought him a cup of tea he hadn't asked for, and spoke to him in the loud, slow, patronizing tone one uses for a toddler or a tourist who doesn't speak the language. "We have a visitor coming today, Arthur dear," she chirped, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "A very nice doctor who's just going to have a little chat with you." Arthur simply nodded, his face a mask of placid incomprehension, while the tiny digital recorder tucked into the seam of his armchair cushion silently captured every word. Mark arrived shortly before the doctor, dressed in a somber suit, his face arranged into an expression of grave, filial concern. He sat on the ottoman in front of Arthur, taking his father's hand in his own. The gesture, meant to look loving, felt cold and reptilian. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice unnecessarily loud. "Just wanted to be here for you. We're going to get you the best care, I promise." Arthur looked at his son's face, at the carefully feigned sincerity, and felt a profound, icy detachment. The love he had once felt for this man had been replaced by a grim, clinical curiosity. He was observing a specimen, a case study in the pathology of greed. Dr. Evans arrived precisely on time. He was exactly as Eleanor had described him, smooth, charming, with a reassuring bedside manner that was as polished and insincere as a timeshare salesman's smile. He carried a worn leather briefcase that was clearly meant to convey an air of old-fashioned, trustworthy professionalism. "Mr. Albright," he boomed, striding into the room and shaking Arthur's hand with a firm, confident grip. "A pleasure to meet you. I'm Dr. Evans. Your family has told me so much about you." Arthur gave him a vague, watery smile and a slight nod. The performance had begun. The evaluation was a grotesque piece of theater. Dr. Evans sat opposite Arthur, leaning in with an expression of deep empathy, and began his assessment. He spoke loudly and slowly, his questions insultingly simple. "Arthur, can you tell me what year it is?" Arthur stared at him blankly for a moment, then looked towards the window. "The roses," he said, his voice distant. Eleanor's roses need watering." Mark and Eleanor exchanged a meaningful, sorrowful glance. "See? He's completely disconnected." "That's lovely, Arthur," Dr. Evans said, making a note on his pad. "But the year. Do you know the year?" Arthur looked back at him, a flicker of what seemed like confusion in his eyes. "Tuesday," he said with an air of finality. The charade continued. Dr. Evans asked him to identify common objects. When shown a pen, Arthur called it a writing stick. When shown a key, he turned it over in his hand and tried to use it to stir his water glass. He played the part of a man whose mind was a beautiful, intricate machine that had finally, irrevocably broken down. He was so convincing that a part of him felt a genuine pang of loss for the character he was portraying. Throughout the examination, Arthur was acutely aware of the hidden recorders, silently capturing every condescending question, every false expression of concern, every carefully orchestrated moment of his supposed incompetence. After 20 minutes of this humiliating performance, Dr. Evans leaned back with a sigh of professional gravity. He closed his notepad and turned to Eleanor and Mark, his voice, now a low, serious murmur, pitched just loud enough for them to hear, but supposedly out of range for the deaf man in the chair. "The situation is, I'm afraid, quite clear," he said, shaking his head sadly. "The hearing loss has acted as an accelerant for a pre-existing and quite advanced case of senile dementia. His cognitive functions are severely impaired. He's disoriented, his short-term memory is virtually non-existent, and he is, frankly, incapable of making rational decisions about his own welfare." He paused, letting the weight of his fraudulent diagnosis settle in the room. "In my professional opinion, he represents a significant risk to himself if left unsupervised. He requires a structured, 24-hour care environment. I will prepare a full report for the court, recommending the immediate appointment of a legal guardian." Eleanor produced a flawless, well-rehearsed tear. "Oh, doctor," she whispered, dabbing her eye with a handkerchief. "We were so afraid of this. We just want what's best for him." "Of course you do," Dr. Evans said, patting her hand reassuringly. "You're doing the right thing. It's a difficult but necessary step." After the doctor left, his briefcase presumably full of his 30 pieces of silver, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The performance was over. Eleanor and Mark, believing they were alone in their victory, dropped the masks of concern. "Well," Eleanor said, pouring herself a large glass of wine, "that went even better than I expected. He was perfect." "He bought the whole act," Mark agreed, a triumphant smirk on his face. "The writing stick? That was a stroke of genius, Mom." They laughed, a sound that was sharp and ugly in the quiet house. They stood in the living room, just feet from where Arthur sat with his eyes closed, and celebrated their success. "It's done, then," Mark said, raising his own glass. "Once we have the guardianship, we can finally move forward, sell this place, pay off my debts, and get him settled." "To the future," Eleanor said, clinking her glass against his, "and to finally getting what we deserve." Arthur sat in his chair, a silent, unseen observer at his own wake. He had given them every opportunity to show a shred of decency, of love, of remorse. They had shown none. They had celebrated his dementia, toasted to his legal demise. He had all the proof he needed. The trap had been sprung, and now all that was left was to reveal the hunter. A few days later, the summons came. Eleanor approached Arthur with a gentle, pitying smile, a stark contrast to the triumphant smirk he had witnessed after the doctor's visit. She handed him a heavy, cream-colored envelope. "Arthur, dear," she said loudly, enunciating each word with exaggerated care. "We're having a small family meeting on Saturday, just to discuss your future care. It's important that you're there, even if you don't understand everything." He nodded vaguely, taking the envelope. The family meeting was, he knew, the final act of their play. It was the moment they would unveil their difficult but necessary decision to their extended family, seeking their approval and solidifying their narrative of being devoted, long-suffering caregivers. They were not just seeking legal guardianship, they were seeking social absolution. On Saturday afternoon, the house filled with the low murmur of concerned voices. Eleanor had invited her sister, Susan, and her husband, a bland, compliant man named Robert. Mark had brought his wife, Jennifer, who looked deeply uncomfortable, and his daughter, Lila, who sat quietly in a corner, her eyes darting nervously towards Arthur. She knew something was wrong, and she had slipped a small folded note into Arthur's hand when she arrived. It read, "Mr. Chen is coming." Arthur sat in his usual armchair, the designated throne of his infirmity. He played his part to perfection, staring blankly at the wall, occasionally humming a tuneless, nonsensical melody. He was the picture of a man lost to the fog of old age. Once everyone was settled with coffee and cake, Mark stood up, clearing his throat. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, his expression a carefully rehearsed mask of sorrow and responsibility. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice thick with false emotion. This is one of the hardest things I've ever had to do." He paused, looking at Arthur with a pained expression. "As you all know, Dad hasn't been himself lately. Since the surgery, his decline has been rapid. He's confused, he's forgetful, and frankly, he's no longer safe on his own." He held up the report from Dr. Evans. "We had him evaluated by a specialist, Dr. Evans. His diagnosis was conclusive, advanced dementia. He recommends immediate, full-time professional care." Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "We've agonized over this," she said, her voice trembling beautifully, "but we have to do what's best for him. We've decided to petition the court for guardianship, to protect him, to manage his affairs and ensure he gets the care he needs." Susan and Robert nodded sympathetically. "Oh, you poor things," Susan said. "It's such a terrible burden to bear." It was a perfect performance. They had the audience in the palm of their hands. They were the heroes of this sad story. And then the doorbell rang. Eleanor looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "I'll get it," she said. When she opened the door, she found a man she did not recognize. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He was flanked by two other individuals, a man and a woman, who looked equally professional and serious. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "My name is David Chen. I am Mr. Arthur Albright's legal counsel. I believe this meeting concerns my client." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Mark and Eleanor exchanged a look of pure panic. A lawyer? Their father had a lawyer? "I'm sorry," Mark stammered, stepping forward. "There must be some mistake. My father is unwell. He's not capable of retaining counsel." "On the contrary," David Chen said, stepping into the room, his associates following him. "My client is perfectly capable, and he has instructed me to attend this meeting on his behalf. In fact, he has instructed me to contribute to the discussion." He placed his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it. "You've presented a medical opinion from a Dr. Evans," he said, looking at Mark. "We, too, have sought medical opinions." He produced a document and handed it to Mark. "This is a full neuropsychiatric evaluation of Mr. Albright, conducted 2 days ago by Dr. Annabelle Reed, the head of neurology at University Hospital. It concludes, and I quote, 'The patient exhibits cognitive functions well above average for his age group, with no signs of dementia or any other degenerative neurological condition.'" He then turned to the woman who had entered with him. "This is Nurse Ramirez. She was the attending nurse who conducted the initial hearing test on Mr. Albright at the hospital post-operation. Nurse, would you be so kind as to read your sworn affidavit?" Nurse Ramirez cleared her throat and read from the paper in her hand. "On the date of the examination, the patient, Arthur Albright, demonstrated a clear and deliberate refusal to respond to auditory stimuli. His physical reactions and eye contact indicated full awareness and comprehension. It was my professional assessment at the time that the patient was feigning hearing loss." A collective gasp went through the room. Susan and Robert stared at Eleanor and Mark, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. But David Chen was not finished. He took a small digital device from his briefcase. "And now, regarding the love and care my client has been receiving." He pressed a button, and the room filled with Eleanor's voice, crisp and clear from the hidden recorder. "It's time to get rid of the old man. He's not all there anymore. This surgery was the final straw." He played the next track, Mark's voice. "Once we have guardianship, we can sell the house, pay off my debts, and the rest goes into a care fund for him, which, of course, we will manage." He played another, Eleanor's laugh, sharp and cruel. "You know, it's almost a blessing, this deafness. He's become so much easier to manage, so quiet, so compliant." The recordings played on, a devastating soundtrack of their greed and deceit. With each new revelation, the color drained from Eleanor's and Mark's faces. They were trapped, exposed, their carefully constructed narrative of love and care utterly demolished by their own recorded words. When the last recording faded into silence, the room was as quiet as a tomb. All eyes were on the two conspirators who sat frozen in their chairs, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated terror. And then, from the armchair in the corner, a new sound emerged. It was Arthur. He was slowly, deliberately clapping. The soft, rhythmic applause was the most terrifying sound they had ever heard. The soft, deliberate sound of Arthur's clapping cut through the suffocating silence of the room. It was a slow, measured applause, each clap a hammer blow against the fragile composure of his wife and son. He rose from his armchair, not as a frail, confused old man, but with the steady, grounded presence of a judge ascending to the bench. He looked at Eleanor and Mark, his eyes clear, sharp, and utterly devoid of the vacant haze they had grown so accustomed to. The room held its breath. Eleanor's sister, Susan, stared at him, her hand covering her mouth. Mark's wife, Jennifer, looked as if she was about to be physically ill. Lila, from her corner, watched her grandfather with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. Arthur let his gaze rest on his wife, then his son. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the weak, reedy tone he had been feigning. It was his true voice, a calm, resonant baritone that filled the room with an authority they had long forgotten. "I heard everything," he said. The 4 words were simple, but they landed with the force of a physical explosion. Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp, her face crumpling into a mask of horror. Mark visibly flinched, shrinking back in his chair as if trying to make himself smaller. The truth, so long concealed, was now a blinding light in the center of the room, and there was nowhere for them to hide. "Every word," Arthur continued, his voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Every whispered plan, every complaint, every joke made at the expense of the helpless old man. I heard your concern, Eleanor. I heard your solution, Mark. I heard you toasting to my legal death with my own wine in my own house." He took a step forward. "You thought my silence was weakness. You thought my deafness was an opportunity. You were wrong. It was a lens. It was a tool that allowed me to see you, to hear you, for who you truly are. Not a family, but a committee of 2, whose only business is greed." He turned to his sister-in-law. "Susan, you have sat in my home, eaten my food, and listened to your sister plot to steal my freedom. You are no longer welcome here." Susan, her face ashen, grabbed her husband's arm and practically fled the room without a word. Then he faced his son. "Mark," he said, and the name was a judgment. "You are a disappointment, not because you failed in business. Many men fail, but because you tried to build your success on the ruins of your own father. You saw my life's work not as a legacy to be honored, but as a resource to be plundered. You are a coward." Finally, he turned to his wife. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, the weight of their 40 years together hanging between them. The love, the memories, the shared history, all of it now tainted by her profound betrayal. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softening with a deep, weary sadness. "Of all the hurts, yours is the deepest. You were my partner, my confidant. I would have given you anything you asked for. But you didn't ask. You chose to steal. You chose to conspire with our son to have me declared a non-person. You looked at the man you promised to love in sickness and in health, and you saw only an obstacle." "Arthur, she began, her voice a desperate, trembling whisper. "There's nothing left to say," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "You have said it all when you thought I could not hear." He turned to his lawyer. "David, if you would." David Chen stepped forward, his expression grim. He addressed Eleanor and Mark directly. "As of this morning, Mr. Albright has filed for a legal separation from you, Mrs. Albright, on the grounds of conspiracy and financial abuse. All joint assets have been frozen pending a full legal review. He will be filing for divorce." He then handed a thick envelope to Mark. "Mr. Mark Albright, this is a formal notice. My client has compiled a comprehensive dossier detailing your attempts to secure fraudulent loans using his assets as collateral, as well as your conspiracy to commit fraud against the court system. We will be turning this dossier over to your employer's board of directors and to the district attorney's office on Monday morning, unless you tender your resignation from your family, effective immediately." My family?" Mark stammered. "You will relinquish any and all claims to the Albright name and any future inheritance," David Chen clarified. "You will sign a legally binding document drafted by me, severing all familial ties and responsibilities." In exchange for your complete and permanent disappearance from his life, my client will agree not to press criminal charges." It was a brutal, elegant solution. He was not just disinheriting them, he was legally erasing them from his life. "You can't do this," Eleanor sobbed. "We're your family." "No," Arthur said, his voice final. "You were my family. Now, you're just people I used to know." He then walked over to the corner where Lila sat, her face streaked with tears. He knelt before her, his old knees protesting, and took her small hands in his. "None of this is your fault, my love," he said softly, his voice now filled with the warmth he had reserved only for her. "You are the only one who saw me, the only one who loved me without condition." He turned to David Chen. "The trust," he said. "Yes," the lawyer confirmed. "Mr. Albright has established an irrevocable educational trust in your name, Lila. It is substantial, and it is protected from any and all claims by your parents. Your future is secure." He looked back at his granddaughter. "You are my legacy, Lila. Not the company, not the money. Your kindness, your loyalty. That is the only part of this family worth saving." He stood up, his back straight, and addressed the wreckage of his family one last time. "The meeting is over," he said. "I would like you all to leave my house now." Eleanor and Mark stared at him, their faces a mixture of disbelief, hatred, and the dawning, terrifying realization that their world had been utterly and irrevocably destroyed. They had plotted to take everything from him. Instead, they had lost everything themselves. They stumbled out of the room, defeated and exposed, leaving behind the ruins of a family they had poisoned with their own greed. Arthur stood in the center of his living room. The silence that returned was not the silence of deafness, but the clean, quiet, and beautiful sound of freedom. In the aftermath of the family meeting, the silence that descended upon the house was of a quality Arthur had not known in years. It was not the muffled, isolating silence of his feigned deafness, nor the heavy, grief-stricken silence that had followed his surgery. It was a clean, expansive quiet, filled with the crisp, clear air of truth. The departure of his wife and son was swift and absolute. Faced with legal and social ruin, they signed every document David Chen put in front of them. Eleanor moved in with her sister, her social stand-in shattered, her future a bleak landscape of dependence and quiet shame. Mark, stripped of his job and his family name, disappeared. Arthur heard rumors months later that he had moved to a different state, taken a low-level sales job, a man forced to start over from the bottom, haunted by the ghost of the life he had tried to steal. Arthur did not sell the house. The home that had been the stage for his betrayal now became his sanctuary of healing. He began the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming it, of filling it with his own life, his own sounds. The first thing he did was buy a new stereo system. It was a beautiful piece of equipment with a warm, rich sound. He unpacked his old collection of vinyl records, which had been gathering dust in the attic for decades. He placed a jazz album on the turntable, Oscar Peterson, a favorite from his youth. As the first, clear, cascading notes of the piano filled the living room, Arthur closed his eyes. He'd been so afraid of losing his hearing, of being trapped in a world of silence. He had never realized that he had already been living in a different kind of silence for years, the silence of being unheard, of being unseen. The music was not just a sound, it was a resurrection. His life with Lila blossomed. With her parents gone, David Chen helped Arthur secure temporary legal guardianship, a process made simple by the mountain of evidence against Mark and Eleanor. Lila moved into the guest room, and the quiet house was suddenly filled with the light, easy sounds of her presence. The soft murmur of her voice on the phone with friends, the gentle thud of her school books on the kitchen table, her laughter as they played chess in the evenings. She became his ears, and he became her anchor. They would sit in the garden together, and she would describe the sounds he had missed. "That's a cardinal, Grandpa," she would say. "His song is short and sharp, like a whistle. And that one, the low cooing, that's a mourning dove." Through her, he learned to listen to the world again, not just with his ears, but with his heart. He found joy in simple things. He discovered a love for cooking, filling the kitchen with the aromas of baking bread and simmering stews. He took up gardening again, his hands finding a familiar comfort in the soil. He read voraciously, not to pass the time, but to engage with the world of ideas. He was not just living, he was thriving. One afternoon, about 6 months after the confrontation, David Chen came to visit. He brought with him a file. "The divorce is final," he said, his tone gentle. "And I have news about Dr. Evans. The state medical board has permanently revoked his license, based on the evidence we provided and the testimony from the other families you helped us find. He's also facing multiple felony fraud charges." Arthur nodded slowly. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction in the man's ruin. He just felt a quiet sense of rightness, of a balance restored. "And this," David said, handing him a letter. "This arrived at my office for you. It's from Eleanor." Arthur took the letter. He recognized his wife's elegant, lupin handwriting on the envelope. He sat with it for a long time after David left, unopened. That evening, he finally read it. It was not a letter of apology, not really. It was a letter of bewildered regret, the words of a woman who had lost her way and couldn't understand how. "I don't know when I started to see you as a problem instead of a partner," she wrote. "I think I was just so afraid of getting old, of being helpless, and I projected all of that fear onto you. I destroyed everything. I know that now. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just hope that you have found peace." He folded the letter and put it away. He felt a pang of sadness for the woman she had once been, but the love he had felt for her was a distant country he could no longer visit. He had found his peace, but not with her. His new life was not a grand adventure. It was a series of quiet, beautiful moments. It was teaching Lila how to play the piano. It was having long, rambling conversations with David Chen over a chessboard. It was sitting in his garden on a warm summer evening, a glass of wine in his hand, listening to the crickets chirp, a sound he had once feared he would never hear again. He had pretended to be deaf to discover the truth about his family. But in the end, the deception had given him something far more valuable. It had forced him to listen to himself, to his own needs, his own desires, his own worth. He had lost a wife and a son, but he had found himself. And as he sat there, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn, the sound of his granddaughter's laughter drifting from the house, Arthur realized that the sound of his own freedom was the sweetest music he had ever heard.